Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin in the name of God. Good evening, everyone, and assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the second episode of And the Survey Says, our new video series that will explore and discuss HEART's research efforts, as well as feature the research of our partners. My name is Nadia Mohajer, and I am Executive Director of HEART, and I am thrilled to welcome you today to continue the discussion that we began last month. Next slide, please. So given the nature of our work and the issues that we will be exploring in our research, we understand that some of what we will present may be triggering, upsetting, or difficult to process. So we ask that you do what you need to take care of yourself. This can look like turning off your camera, getting snacks, keeping your hands busy, or leaving to process or ground yourself. There will also be a Q&A at the end of this series, or at the end of this talk, as well as a list of resources that we can send out for you to learn more. Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I know we began a few minutes late. We just wanted to give some folks a chance to trickle in. So moving on to the agenda, I wanted to first real quickly give a little bit of background on HEART for those of you who may be new to this organization. Our ongoing programming can be summed up in our acronym HEART. So health education, which is our largest programming arm, we provide comprehensive, culturally sensitive sexual health and sexual violence information through interactive and in-person and virtual programming. We also do advocacy, which is at the individual level. Our trained advocates will offer additional information, support, and additional referrals for folks on a one-on-one basis to move toward healing and justice. And at a systemic level, we also work to reduce the barriers to services and information, working with institutions and policies. And at a structural level, we will advocate for system change to disrupt and rebuild the world that we want to live in. We do research where we work with universities and partners to conduct research specific to Muslim communities to be able to develop effective, sustainable programming and contribute to peer-reviewed literature. And we offer training and technical assistance to mainstream organizations and Muslim institutions to build their capacity to better serve sexual and reproductive health needs of Muslim communities. So today, as you know, the work that we will be highlighting today is actually our research and evaluation from a year-long anti-sexual violence advocacy training program that we did on 5 campuses, and the studies that it sort of inspired afterwards. So just to recap the agenda, we're going to do a real quick recap of our last month's episode. We're going to do introductions of the full research team that is here today to present. We're going to talk a little bit about the programs and the findings, and then we're going to move into discussion on some of the implications for future work, the student activism that resulted, and a group dialogue, completed by an audience Q&A. So last month, we explored 3 connected but independent research studies that explore the burden of sexual violence in Muslim communities, barriers to services, and attitudes and beliefs. If you missed last month's episode, don't worry. We actually have it on YouTube. I'm dropping the link in the chat box. And it was a really fascinating conversation that was looking at significant gender differences that we found between our men respondents and women respondents. So first, to begin, we found that 91 of our Muslim student respondents, of them, 80.2% knew someone who experienced some form of sexual harassment on campus, while 54.9% knew someone who experienced some form of sexual violence. And those were defined so that they could distinguish the difference between sexual harassment and acts of sexual violence. The next finding that we found were that Muslim students' familiarity with the terms rape culture, victim blaming, sexual assault, male privilege, and consent also varied based on gender. So for example, we found that more women were familiar with the term male privilege, so 96.9% of women, compared to only 61.5% of men. And this also, we found a similar trend with words like terms like rape culture and victim blaming and sexual assault. And the final finding that we discussed in the last session was that we found that rape culture attitudes also varied significantly between Muslim men and women on campus. So for example, when we asked for them to agree or disagree with the following statement, a woman who has experienced sexual assault is less desirable than a partner, 92.2% of women strongly disagreed with that statement, while only 57.7% Muslim men did. So we found this to be statistically significant relationship between the genders, and this is actually consistent with all of our additional attitude statements that we asked. But one thing that we want to point out is that these findings are actually, in fact, consistent with mainstream literature. So we don't want to paint this as a problem that is specific to Muslim men or Muslim communities, but rather a trend that exists across gender in general. So research shows that statistically significant gender differences, no matter what culture, race, or religion or background, actually do exist. It's even in college campuses, we compared comparable demographics. So this led to a very engaging discussion on these findings. We also invited Yasmin, who's with us today. We'll be introducing her shortly, from the Center for Urban Research and Learning, to talk a little bit about her ongoing research that she did with Muslim men on campus. And also Alia, who wanted to talk a little bit about some of the implications of these findings. So if, for example, if more men are likely to hold problematic attitudes about sexual violence and are also more likely to hold leadership positions, what implications does that have on who is believed, on what kinds of safe spaces exist, on how power moves in our communities, and who is uplifted and who is marginalized? So again, if you haven't been able to watch our first episode, please do. It's really great. The YouTube link is in the chat box. And this next episode is really going to build off of some of the conversations that we started last month. And we're gonna, really move into a conversation on power and privilege, specifically on on campuses among Muslim students. So before that, I'd really like to introduce a little bit about the fabulous group of speakers today. I mentioned that, we're going to be looking at a qualitative study that followed our trained student leaders for 6 months, and the activism that took place and the lessons that we learned with respect to how power and privilege plays out in Muslim groups on campus. So I wanted to introduce a few of our amazing research team and student fellows that are joining us today. Once again, I'm Nadia Mohajer, and I'm the Executive Director of HEART, and I am located in Chicago. So I'll turn it over to Yasmin.
Hi all, I'm Yasmin Khair. I'm the Research Coordinator at the Center for Urban Research and Learning at Loyola in Chicago as well. I assisted HEART with some of this research over the last few years while with Curl. And yes, I'm just really excited to keep digging into this research a bit more with you all. I'll pass it on to Alia.
Hello and salam, everyone. My name is Alia Asmat. I use she, her pronouns. I've been working with HEART for about 9 years now. And in this project, I took on the role of a trainer, so training some of the campus students who are participating, as well as being kind of a research coordinator and assistant, looking through data and writing up some of the results. I'm currently wrapping up my PhD in counseling psych, and I'll be in private practice in August in Georgia. Janine, I'll bounce it to you.
Thanks, Alia. Hi, everyone. My name is Janine. My pronouns are she, hers. I got started back with HEART 3 or 4 years ago. It's all a blur now. As a student fellow, and continued that work post-graduation, been involved in this project to really incorporate the student activist part into this report, alongside Humam. So I'll pass it on to him. Oh, I'm based in San Diego.
Sorry, I cut you off. Hi, everyone. My name is Humam Al-Mahdi, he, him, his pronouns. I started interning for Heart in 2016 during undergrad, and then eventually got hired as a student leadership coordinator for our 2 most recent national conferences. I now attend dental school and plan on continuing my work with Heart as a trainer. And I'm from California, but currently based in Arizona.
Thank you so much, everyone. And you'll be hearing a lot from them. I will keep my remarks really short. If we move to the next slide, I wanted to just real quickly also acknowledge that while there are a few of us here today, this project and research actually involves a much bigger team. First and foremost, we want to acknowledge and give gratitude to the Center for Urban Research and Learning at Loyola University, specifically Yasmin, Monica, Gina, and David, who have really worked hard to help us develop some intentional evaluation tools and research tools to actually get the information that we wanted to get. We wanted to also acknowledge our funders at the Reliance at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and AAUW that really invested in this work and thought it was important. The Heart team, myself, Alia, Sahar, and Samira that helped implement the actual programming that was evaluated. And then of course, our student fellows, our Heart fellows on these 5 campuses that were our student leaders and were the participants of this research study and evaluation. And then Zinat and Shazia, who I will be dropping the link shortly, designed our really beautiful forward-facing report that resulted from this research. So we will be introducing that report shortly. So I'm actually going to drop the link right now. So the research, as I mentioned, the research that we're about to present is all available in the following report. I encourage you to look at this and read it and enjoy it. Visually, it is stunning. So want to give credit to Zinat and Shazia for really bringing their creative minds to this. And just a real quick overview on the program itself. So in the 2018-2019 school year, we hosted a year-long sexual violence advocacy program. And the idea was that we would recruit Muslim student leaders, train them over the course of 2 days on sexual violence, how to support survivors, and work towards prevention in their student organizations. And then empower them to lead 2 more campaigns or programs on their campus that was reaching their student body. And one of them was a Sexual Violence 101 that they co-facilitated with us. The results of that program, the shorter 2-hour workshop, is what we discussed in last month's webinar. So what we're going to discuss in this month's webinar is the 25 student leaders that we trained and spent a whole year working with. So as you can see, the program had 3 parts. It was training these student leaders to be survivors, and then they would co-facilitate a larger workshop for their student body, and then participate in some pilot research and evaluation. So, the goals were really so that we could be attentive and inclusive to the needs of Muslim survivors on campus, offer survivors the non-judgmental support and safety that they were looking for, and actively work to dismantle the structural barriers that Muslim survivors face when seeking justice and healing. So key characteristics of the program really included a few of these that I know will come up when Alia in particular talks about why this program was so effective and some of the implications for future work. But some of the key things that we wanted to highlight was that this program was 100% in partnership with students. And so we consider this program to be student/survivor led. The folks that were leading this work were directly impacted on campus, were a lot of them identified as survivors, and they, were seen as the experts in their campus community and what would work and what would not work to implement this program. The majority of students that participated in this program were Muslim and or people of color. Again, it was co-created in partnership with HEART. It was healing centered and really strength-based and honored identities, and really approached it from an intersectional lens. So oftentimes when you go, when a lot of these programs happen, we talk about these issues by compartmentalizing them, but instead what we wanted to do was really bring an intersectional, interdisciplinary approach to this work, really recognizing that you cannot take off a hat or an identity that you wear when you're talking about sexual violence or when you're talking about your faith, etc. And so we wanted to be able to build a space where all people could bring all parts of their identities and all parts of their lived experience and have really nuanced discussions on how they were impacted by sexual violence. So as we developed this program, next slide, please, we considered several questions. So really thinking about, what does it mean to build trust with students on campus and student organizations? What are the barriers to accessing existing resources on campus? So, a lot of large campuses have sexual assault programming, have Title IX offices to file complaints. So what are the barriers that we're facing Muslim students to actually access those? How do structures of power and privilege play out within student groups? How can we build a program that has a commitment to authentic inclusion versus tokenism? So a lot of times, really looking at what kinds of relationship building must be done in order to facilitate an inclusion that feels authentic and not tokenizing. And finally, what do students need to feel safe and a sense of belonging in the spaces that they desire to occupy on campus? So the research methods, moving on to the next slide, was that in partnership with Curl at Loyola, we developed a pre and post test that was administered to our student leaders. We had 25 that we ultimately trained. So at the beginning of their 2-day training, they took a pre-test before they were trained at all. And then right after the training, they took a post-test. And then there was also a 6-month follow-up survey and also focus group interviews that were also conducted. So what did we find? Quantitatively, the most compelling data that we found from the quantitative part of the study, which was the pre and post test, was that our student fellows left the program feeling much more equipped to responding to a disclosure of sexual violence and be a resource for other students. So essentially, we learned that HEART programming is effective in building the capacity of participants to better meet the needs of survivors. We also learned that the skills in this program they felt were universal skills that can be applied to any one needing support. So particularly this applied to our Responding with Rahma framework. We have a very quick framework of the Rahma principles, which facilitates, is a step-by-step process on how to respond to someone that is disclosing for the first time that they have experienced sexual violence. And the feedback that we got about this framework was that they felt that this framework was universal for any sensitive disclosure and not just something that was specific to violence. So really they felt like they gained skills in order to be able to hold space with their peers on a variety of different issues. And finally, we found that Muslim students found it uncomfortable and stigmatizing to openly talk about sexual violence as an issue affecting Muslims on campus. And that is something that Yasmin is going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into. So just the next slide is just a visual to show, the before the training and after the training. So before the training, about 5% of students that were trained felt very well equipped to address the needs of their peers and Muslim survivors. And by the end of the training, it went up to 58%. So, just kind of showing that there was a dramatic increase in folks feeling equipped. And, they felt like they now had the skills to be an active listener, to provide resources, tangible resources to survivors, and also offer more critical and conscious responses to sexual violence. And now I'm going to turn it over to Yasmin to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Nadia. Yeah, so we'll kind of get into more of the qualitative findings a little bit. So continuing with these, so for Muslim students on these campuses, the HEART workshops and the trainings were really the first time that they were offered, that these students were offered a space to explore sexual health and sexual violence, particularly through a culturally specific lens that was catered to their needs, their concerns, and their cultural religious experiences. And, kind of moving through that, one of the huge barriers that they were facing was trying to continue this HEART programming on campuses. And it really came from a lack of support from Muslim-led organizations, especially ones that had deeper connections to the wider Muslim community on campus. So it really alerted the students involved with HEART of institutional barriers in their own communities that were blatantly ignoring the needs of Muslim survivors on campus. We'll discuss this a little bit more later in the presentation, but it connects with, finding 6 in that just really focusing on the power that intersectional programming can provide to students and facilitate student-led activism based on the needs and barriers that they've identified. And then taking action to create those safer spaces on campus for Muslim survivors. To the next slide, please. So specifically student trainers, they were asked how their campuses responded and prevented sexual violence on their campuses. But unfortunately, most of the universities really lacked the institutional supports, especially ones that were tailored particularly to Muslim survivors. And instead, the students felt like they had to create their own supports and do the own work on campus. So as one student shared, all the prevention work being done is just students who spend a lot of physical and emotional labor to complete these things. So leaving the students kind of struggling to create their own safe spaces when it really should be the responsibility of these universities to hold space and provide healing for their students. Next slide, please. And then students were also asked specifically about, their Muslim communities at their respective campuses, and like how they felt the general atmosphere around sexual violence was with those Muslims. But many of the students shared that they shared words associated with like fear and harm, difficult, awkward, controversial, frustrating when discussing sexual violence with other Muslims. So there was both a deep denial from Muslim students that this kind of programming and the conversations were needed, but conversations were being had, myths were being debunked, students were engaging in dismantling these deeper issues. And surprisingly, a lot of Muslim men were beginning to attend HEART's programming and entering spaces that they likely did not even exist for them before. And as one of our students said, I don't know how I would have measured that, but I do know that it was good to see, especially Muslim males coming to the workshops and whatnot, having these conversations, because, a lot of, in my perspective, a lot of them, from what I've seen, a lot of males tend to not want to have this conversation or feel like it's not about them. So really trying to engage all folks to really engage this work and not just put it on the burden back on survivors and particularly women. Next slide, please. And then students were also lacking spaces on their campuses and with their peers on campus, but they also had difficulty sharing their new understandings around sexual violence with their families and closest friends. It was a reminder to us again of the deeply ingrained myths, the generational barriers, and the language and cultural barriers that are stopping Muslims from engaging sexual violence across their networks and not just with their peers. Students were also asked about the impact of Islamophobia on their work on campus. And it mostly came up as a reason for Muslim students to avoid bringing up sexual violence in fear of attracting, more Islamophobic consequences. However, one student did, rebut and reflected that, the danger of internalizing that Islamophobia and allowing the stigma of sexual violence to continue. And they said, somebody may want to protect their religion against whatever is being said in society or wherever they live. And so they sit with the discomfort, they sit with the pain instead of coming forward. And that really showcased the danger and the pain that can come with, always being on the defense against Islamophobia rather than, bringing up the issues that are still hindering our communities, no matter how targeted the whole community is from the outside. To the next slide, please. And so we want to spend a little bit time of kind of focusing on the barriers to the change on campus. And a lot of this we'll get into a bit more in more of a dialogue, but overall, it was really clear that after assessing the general campus climate, we asked students to reflect on some of the barriers and challenges they face to implementing and navigating change on their campuses for survivors. So on a logistical level, students had a really difficult time creating workshops due to scheduling and administrative difficulties with other student organizations. But the greatest barrier was engaging other, their Muslim communities and organizations on campus in a serious, open manner when it came to sexual violence and creating spaces for Muslim survivors. Heart Fellows really wanted to partner with large Muslim student groups on campus, but they were often met with deep mistrust or victim blaming tactics and just a real devaluing and erasing of the needs of Muslim survivors on campus. And these tensions were only, these tensions were really exacerbated by a lot of religious justification against supporting survivors, misogyny, homophobia, and activism shaming, but both within and outside Muslim communities on campus. If you can go to the next slide. So I just want to show a few quotes. I won't read through these because they're a bit lengthy, but just showing that there are quite a bit of barriers that our students were facing, whether it was being labeled as a feminist, and which in most spaces would be great, but within our Muslim community is often seen as a as a way of being not Islamic enough and things like that. Then also having folks outside of our community questioning whether our ability to talk about sexual violence, if we would be inclusive enough, if we would be, willing to kind of have harder and more critical conversations around sexual violence. So with that, I will turn it to Alia, and she'll talk a little bit more about the implications, and we'll get into more of kind of the specifics of these barriers a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Yasmin and Nadia, for describing the study. So I'm sure you all are wondering, what does this all mean? What are we going to do? And so really just to summarize some of the findings and what we want to have a conversation about today with you all and with each other in the next sort of 20 minutes, in a bit really, is that there is a need for victim-centric spaces for Muslim survivors. I mean, our data showed that there were folks that needed this space, appreciated this space, and that there's tensions in creating this space. And a part of my job in this project was also to look at the academic literature around this. And so we know from the lived experiences of our participants that victim-centric spaces are needed, but we also know that from the scholarly literature, that sexual violence programming, or at least the paperwork on that, is often white-led and often lacks an analysis that attends to race, that attends to sexual orientation, ability status, and gender identity, just to name a few. And so our participants also sort of alluded to that when they talked about managing institutional Islamophobia, when they talked about, microaggressions occurring, when they talked about the surprise from non-Muslim peers that they're open to even discussing sexual violence. And so what this kind of reinforces by not having these spaces is that Muslims are not impacted by sexual violence, which we know is just not true. And these sorts of narratives also assume that sexual violence is happening to less religious or non-Muslim people only, which is a huge assumption and a very problematic assumption to make around who deserves support in the community. And then finally, at least with this, one takeaway, what we saw was the burden of this advocacy often falls on the most directly impacted. And that again connects to a lot of the scholarship around student activism with folks with marginalized identities. And so often engaging in student activism is a way for marginalized students to respond to campus environments, to reassert and resist this type of bigotry, dehumanization, however you want to call these experiences. And so activism can be seen and is often seen as a way to empower and resist. And so one of the barriers that we found in this work is unfortunately one of the biggest barriers in engaging in campus student activism from Muslim survivors was actually the Muslim organizations on campus, there are several that you might think of, but the pushback that we saw was that, again, like Yasmin mentioned, that folks are being rebellious, that folks are being too liberal or divisive or less religious. And so not only is this pretty dismissive of the student activism, but we also know that student activists often, in addition to doing their own homework, their own other campus activities, and advocating for their own needs that their religious community could not provide, contributes to a lot of burnout, right? So when you are fighting to be seen in your religious community, that also can have an impact on your own well-being and your own sort of labor, right? And so a number of marginalized students on campus, including many of the Black student activists that I have known from my experiences on campus, this is pushing a lot of the same narratives in the academic literature that student activists should be compensated for this labor or at least be recognized for this labor. So this is another conversation, but that's what I'm sort of highlighting in the literature that's also coming out. And then finally, if you could go to the next slide. Engagement around sexual violence on campuses also highlights how power and privilege manifests in Muslim communities. So here, the discussion piece, or the thing that we really want you all to be thinking about and that we've been thinking about is, who is seen in these MSA spaces, or these predominantly Muslim spaces on campus, who's included, who is often feels a sense of belonging, and how do we ensure that all types of Muslims, including Muslim survivors, regardless of how we perceive their religiosity, regardless of how we perceive their experiences, how can we include that into not just campus experiences, but also sexual violence programming? And so this question around how is nuance around faith and faith-related journeys erased when we don't commit to sexual violence programming really I want us to think about is sometimes not everyone has a perfect relationship with faith. And often conversations about sexual violence, regardless of how uncomfortable they are, impact our faith and our faith journeys. And so when we deny students and young people the opportunity to have these conversations, what is the impact on faith and faith journeys as well? In terms of the academic scholarship here, again, really wanting us to think about how campus spaces can be constructed in which student activism is uplifted, is compensated, and is also attending to the burnout and the compassion fatigue that students are going through. And finally, I don't want to erase the resilience of student activists. So we know that students that were attending programming were hearing about students and supporting students. And so attending to that, holding that, and also recognizing that many students on campus are supporting each other and creating new spaces in which all of their humanity is sort of attended to and all of their nuance of their Muslim identity is being attended to. And Mom is really going to speak to that in the next slide, where he's going to share a specific about how student activism showed up for him with heart programming.
Awesome. Thank you, Alia. So before the actual chapter was established on our campus, there was initially some programming that was supposed to be planned with the MSA on our campus, separate from the chapter. So initially, a heart member was in communication with the MSA on our campus, and there was a plan to establish a fellowship on our campus. And it took a few months to build that relationship. And when the board of the MSA agreed, then the next school year came around and there was new board members for that MSA. That's when some tension started to happen with some misinformation, some preconceived notions on the board members' side. There was a lot of back and forth, and the board kind of asking Heart to overextend themselves to accommodate with very difficult demands. And when those were settled, new ones would arise. So it seemed as though when I started working with that Heart member to kind of be the liaison between my MSA board, who were my friends, and the Heart staff, it became really tense and uncomfortable because there was a lot of the aforementioned statements and beliefs about, a very specific view on what sexual violence means and what type of person deserves support. And because of that type of Hollywood dramatized version of what they perceived as sexual assault and violence, that they were not okay with having a more broadened and all-encompassing program, that they didn't deserve. It seemed as though they didn't feel like all students deserved that, because they were concerned about the program being a little bit too liberal or not religiously rooted. They were requiring a lot of religious scholars to have input in this. So it was very difficult and tumultuous to work with that. And so because of that difficulty, I decided to reach out to other organizations on campus that had some students of color perhaps Muslim-ish. And I tried to form those support systems so that we could kind of together collectively across several groups and several clubs on campus create this fellowship. And in doing so, there was a lot of surveying asking my friends on campus, my fellow classmates, my Muslim community on campus, and the members of the MSA, doing a petition for establishing the fellowship. There was a town hall meeting. We wanted to maintain an ongoing partnership with MSA, but that wasn't really happening as the months progressed. And the tension became very, very palpable in the spaces we were in, and it made it very uncomfortable to kind of advocate for ourselves. But eventually we became a chapter, and there were several other student leaders who were working alongside me to establish an official chapter and club on campus. And now, after I have graduated, it's become into a regional coalition so that people can still be involved after they graduate in the community at large. And the unfortunate part is that there was a lot of broken friendship as a result of establishing this chapter. And we've kind of tried to forge a new sense of community in addition to grieving the loss of these friendships. So it was a difficult journey. And if Janine has any input, you could feel free to say her input, because she was a part of this too. But that was how, like, a brief overview of how the chapter formed on my campus.
So I think now is a good time to kind of transition into kind of a discussion among all of us, and kind of getting into the specifics of this experience and doing this kind of research and doing this work. So as I kind of mentioned before, one of the findings we found was that numerous barriers to this work came up, including being labeled as, labeling the work as un-Islamic or feminist, the stigma and denial around sexual violence, victim blaming, and other barriers. So I wanted to ask my fellow panelists, which barriers resonate most with you, and what showed up as you did this work on your campus.
Yeah, I can go first. I think Humam did a great overview of what we experienced at our time there, and the success of the chapter now. I think definitely one of the most stark and obvious barrier was being labeled as un-Islamic and feminist, creating fitna in the community, so far as to say that we had religious or spiritual advisors and guest speakers come on campus and openly say, like, feminism is haram and it's taking us away from the path of Islam, and it's one of the signs of judgment, coupled with this idea of shaming student activists and that student activism is haram, and at the same time painting this all on heart when it was unrelated. And multiple times this narrative came up that heart is at our campus, that we were excluding people with this idea of a fellowship, and that it was like a projection of ideals, that this assumption that to be in heart you had to be some kind of Muslim, fall into this liberal narrative. I hate using these binary terms, but that even within that there was a stereotype of what it meant to be part of heart, and that you had that only, and therefore it excluded people who didn't feel it that strongly. At the same time, it became clear that in order to be part of the Muslim organization on campus, that you really had to be only a certain type of Muslim was accepted, and anything that deviated from that was un-Islamic. you know, and that there's always these pressures on our campuses because of the Islamophobia that we face, that we are representing the whole Ummah. And it becomes really dangerous. And then we create this internalized Islamophobia and fear within ourselves that we can't work on the communities, what we're facing, because we're representing Islam, which is really dangerous. And doesn't support our survivors. You know, I think one of the biggest barriers that kept getting lost is people forgot that we're centering Muslim survivors. You know, it made it seem like it was a battle of ego and who can be on the campus and who can speak for the Muslim and represent the Muslim community on campus, and not about the people we were centering who are Muslim survivors. I think even the idea of, you know, other barriers not only showed up within the Muslim organization, was even with the campus assault center, was that there was like a lot of Islamophobia within the structure. I mean, something that was really powerful is they were willing to meet with us and have multiple conversations, and we got to create this partnership of talking about, this is how you respond to Muslim survivors, this is what you're doing wrong. So it was a twofold, and I think that's what hurt the most and was the biggest barriers. We went in thinking like, well, we got the Muslim organization backing us up, so we can take on the Islamophobia in the academia, and then that not being the case. Now, Humam, if you have other things that you want to add on about some of the barriers.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, I think also within the campus community. So our MSA was very, very large, and and even like our groups were, sorry, my iPad is being weird. It was very large. It was, you know, we had very large, like a couple hundred students attending, and alumni, they were very involved. So when this came to play, it became a very public issue. It wasn't a private matter. And so for that reason, it became almost as if there was like a social divide. There were two sides. It was, you're either liberal and Islamic and supportive of Heart, or you are religious and against Heart. You had to be. And so that made it very difficult to maintain friendships. That made it difficult to I guess propel the work with having to kind of console ourselves in where, you know, how we viewed ourselves. And I would say another barrier were the male voices were very loud on campus. I would say the main thing I would hear would be lumping together, you know, the topic of sexual violence advocacy with topics like abortion, sexual identity, and things that, you know, we weren't really centering on, but they would bring those to the forefront and say, like, this is why we don't support this work, because we have, you know, this opposition towards these issues within Islam, which was not really the conversations that we were having to begin with. So it made it very difficult for us to kind of navigate that. And it seemed as though we were missing each other with I guess our starting point for the work.
So thank you both for sharing that. Another one of the findings that we really want to uplift in this conversation is that the burden often falls on the most marginalized or those who are directly impacted. And so I'm just wondering, given that we've talked about how that can further burnout, that can further isolation, and really change experiences on campus, if you be open to sharing how that played out on your campus as well.
Do you want to go first? I mean,
sure, I can go. Yeah, I mean, definitely we saw that 100%, that those most impacted, most marginalized were trying to push this work, and was one of the reasons why it made it so difficult. I know we often talk about Humam and others who brought this on campus, was maybe if we had different identities and we were held identities that were privileged and had power in certain places, it would have been a lot easier to pass this along and get buy-in in the Muslim community on campus. And additionally, what we were coupled with is that, we're student organizers. A lot of us were student leaders. We went from being like 15 people going into this training to getting cut in half to 5 of us, with people graduating. And the pushback from the organizations, and even like the friendships lost, was really emotionally tolling on for some people who didn't want to continue. Just to say, like, Humam talked about how it became difficult to advocate for us in the space. Someone in our group was saying, it became difficult for us to even physically be in the shared space where we would all hang out and like pray and have programming and like book campus events with. So it was, and just, there was so much alienation happening, and there's like being labeled as woke was getting really weaponized against student activists, and like, you're pushing from this at the same time you're working with so many other things. Like, the work is triggering as we're pushing for this. We're constantly at the same time dealing with Islamophobes on campus externally. We're dealing with within the MSA about how everything we're doing, basically denying our faith, that what you're doing isn't Muslim, you're not being a good Muslim, you're not being Islamic, this isn't the Quran, blah, blah, blah. And so there was so much burnout. And I think it was the same people coming up and having to defend themselves from in a community that we should have been accepted in. Humam, if you have more you want to touch on.
Yeah. So I think for me, it also, as much as I was representing, Heart's mission, I also had like a personal attachment to the cause. So as a survivor myself, it was very easy to perceive, the rejection of Heart programming as a personal rejection of my history and pain. And so after the initial pushback, it made it almost like necessary for me to eventually disclose my story to those board members of the MSA who were my friends. And just to kind of elicit some type of connection, humanizing the issue so that it's not just some obscure, far off idea, but that wasn't enough. And that did leave me feeling a little bit exploited, because they didn't really care enough to make space for the healing that I needed, and I know that others needed on campus as well, within a religious community. And in addition to that, turmoil, I also still had to advocate for my community and fellow survivors, while still trying to support myself emotionally. And it was just very disappointing, socially at that time.
Thank you both for being so vulnerable and sharing that with us. I feel like I'm hearing this for the first time, and I'm getting just like frustrated for you both, and the students on campus. And kind of thinking about that, and when you think about the MSA and other groups on campus, what do you think campus spaces need to do to examine how power and privilege plays out in uplifting certain voices and marginalizing others?
So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think the first thing is that MSAs need to realize that their job is not necessarily to preach faith to the campus. And their job is to create a community for Muslims who identify as Muslims, regardless of the perceived religiosity or any cultural differences in practicing the faith. And because college is very isolating, that space is necessary for all Muslims. And excluding Muslims based on sect or social justice involvement or traumatic lived experiences that are uncomfortable to talk about is counterintuitive to the word in Islam. And the second point is that there was a lot of reliance on external guidance for an internal club that was very frustrating to hear about. So like older uncles in the community gave their input on this work when they weren't really affiliated with, they were affiliated with other organizations and not a part of the campus, and not really, not really a part of the campus community. So it didn't really make any sense to have external input from like a spiritual guidance counselor that didn't really involve that demographic. And I think that in itself, reaching out and going out to outsourcing advice in that regard kind of perpetuates the same type of Muslim archetype being in MSA board positions. So typically straight male, religious, born Muslim, Arab or Desi, Sunni background. So when the reality of the matter is that there is much more diversity within the Muslim student population on each campus. And, that includes members who survived abuse, members who are LGBTQ, members who are non-Arabic speakers, members who are converts, so on. And so I think that, having the lens, a very specific lens, and just assuming that that's the uniform of what a Muslim it should be on campus was very damaging.
Yeah, going on with what Humam just illuminated for us is that, MSAs typically don't have that conversation to begin with at any level. It doesn't happen in the membership body. It doesn't happen at the board level. It's not happening with spiritual advisors or these people. I think, again, like Muslim students, when they get elected to these boards, the first thing they're told is this is an amana, and like what you're doing is like you're gonna be, sorry, I'm laughing because it's like so much to do for, like, you're being told that you're gonna be on the day of judgment, you're gonna be asked about this, held accountable to this, and then there gets all this idea of like, well, I can only do what I'm being told. I have to go ask the sheikhs and the imams and the ustads, and I can't be reactive to my campus. And I essentially, like, MSA boards then replicate the power structure and dynamic and privilege that we see in our Muslim communities, on our masajid boards, in the Islamic schools, that, and instead of being a space for change, like Hamam said, instead of being a space really for Muslim students to come together and not feel so excluded, we know how hard it can be to be a Muslim student on a college campus in America. And instead, it becomes about preserving our faith and proving that we're Muslim and we're so happy to be Muslim. Nothing difficult about being Muslim in America, and like really fighting against Islamophobia. And unfortunately, like, the spiritual advisors that MSAs are going to and talking to aren't trauma informed, and they don't have anything to help Muslim survivors on campus or in general. And it becomes taken again, like, that their words are the only thing you can follow. And it becomes weaponized against like Muslim student leaders who want to bring this work on campus. No, we asked the advisor said disagreed with this, and therefore the whole program is shut down and you're alienating Muslims. It becomes very white and black, and there's no in between. And it doesn't leave any area for growth. I think, a big part of the conversation of power and privilege is that we don't talk enough about in our Muslim community that Islam is a religion to better ourselves, and we need to have growth to do that, and to make mistakes within that, and to have these conversations so we can heal ourselves. And again, just that often there's no room in these structures of leadership to really center survivors, center healing for our communities.
I'm just going to co-sign the two of them and really want to uplift something Janine just said, which is MSAs often replicate power and dynamics in the larger community. And I really want to sit with that and really just uplift that point. And also, as I'm no longer in school as of last month, but I also do have empathy for young people on campus, because oftentimes, you're thrown into these positions when you're fresh out of high school, or you're uncertain. This is a time of identity development, identity exploration, and so I really want to put it back on Muslim leaders, Muslim alum of MSA programming, chaplains, to have these conversations early and often and consistently around, who is served. Sorry, I didn't comment. Who is served and who is erased, and how has this historically been attended to? And so some of the questions that I think about here are, because research nerd Elizabeth Cole's questions on intersectionality in research. So who's included in this category and who's missing, right? So we know historically Black Muslim students, students who identify as Shia, students who maybe identify as cultural Muslim, students who identify with the LGBT community are often missing from these conversations, or are not included in these categories around Muslimhood. The second question that she asks us to think about is, what role does inequality play? And I do think class and social class plays out in MSA spaces and on college campuses, but I also want to uplift what you two are saying, which is, what are the practices that are privileged? Whose engagement and healing and faith journeys are we privileging? And what do we lose when we don't include these perspectives that are different? And knowing that historically Islam has been okay with difference and has encouraged that, it feels a little disingenuous to not want to do that. So I just really appreciate what both of you have shared, and want to also invite the audience members here to think about some of these questions in your own college campuses or your own Muslim spaces.
Thank you so much, Alia and Humam and Janine and Yasmin, for such an engaging conversation. We will open it up to the audience. I have one final question that I wanted to ask just to kind of perk the conversation up a little bit and make it a little bit more positive. I know we've been talking a lot about the challenges and barriers to this work, but I also want to uplift, because I know that there were some really incredible successes and opportunities that emerged from this work. So just hoping, Humam and Janine, that you can share a little bit about that, and then we welcome any commentary or questions or anything really from the audience as well.
Yeah, I can begin. So I think something that was so powerful was seeing, as student leaders, our creativity and like, okay, the Muslim org isn't supporting us. Who can support us? Really relying on, staff who weren't even Muslim, but were supporting us and wanted to hear about how they can support us using their privilege and access as staff. We were really able to strengthen relationships with campus partners and departments like the Women's Center and other certain student centers on campus and departments, and even our chapter received recognition for being such a new chapter and creating impact on campus. And we even got to host a lot of great programs on campus. We had a lot of non-Muslims attend our events because they found that even non-Muslim spaces weren't doing enough to talk about sexual assault and violence in the community. And it really allowed for collaborative leadership with different people, different identities coming together for this mission. It was really beautiful in that tried to create this alternative space for Muslims who didn't necessarily fit into the puzzle piece of what makes a Muslim on a college campus. We was no longer that there's only one Muslim voice on campus. Even I think it was good for other departments and academics to see how nuanced our Muslim community is. And even like personally for me, it was this awakening that I don't have to accept only one Muslim narrative. I mean, through Heart, I was exposed to so many different schools of thought and scholars and interpretation. I'm Palestinian. I grew in a Palestinian Muslim household, and I was taught Islam is one way. I didn't even know my school of thought. My school of thought that my family prescribed to me, right, when I went to college, before college, and that it was so empowering to work with students. And it was really a reconciliation of like faith and being grounded in the work around centering Muslim survivors.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. I saw that growth happen on campus as well. And again, I thought the collaboration between the different organizations to make this come to life was very beautiful. And I think the best part was seeing just random like Muslim stragglers from, the outskirts of campus kind of like emerge and join where they were not really drawn to join the MSA. So yeah, and I also saw some cultural shift in the pattern of old MSA behavior. And I think we created a social dialogue that, hopefully will pave the way for more conversations to be made.
Thank you so much, Humam and Janine. Yasmin and Alia, did you have any insights on from the research perspective that you were observing?
I can go ahead. I think for me, I mean, one, hearing from Humam and Janine and seeing, real life examples of, I came into this research just seeing the like text. Like I didn't know anyone. Like I didn't know any of the fellows. I didn't like engage with the programming directly. So to start seeing that there was a real impact of the research that we were doing, and seeing how it could be a tool, the research could be a tool to uplifting these issues that are systemic on campuses. And seeing the intentionality behind all of the research that we were doing was just, it was the first time I was doing research for Muslims with Muslims, and recognizing that there is the space and there is the power in doing that kind of research. And then seeing just a real life model of successful collaborative research that's centering the folks who need that are seeking that service, seeking that healing, at every step of the stage, every step of the research process. And again, like just that was for me a turning point in my research journey, and being like, okay, so we don't have to stick in the ivory tower of academia, but that there really is an impact, and that change is possible through this kind of work. And obviously working with all of you guys, which is lovely.
I think for me, I've just personally, at this point in my life, been reflecting on, does research legitimize or make me more legit as a person? And I think that's a hard no, but it was really compelling for me to see and hear stories and hold lived experiences and be a part of the training, and then do the research and see, wow, this really maps on to what other people have written about, what people have been writing about, what people have been talking about for a very long time. And now we get to add a voice to that conversation, and we get to push forward, because Heart's programming is extremely compelling and nuanced, and we get to say, hey, this worked, and this is a model in which we can perhaps, you know, help others lead with compassion, lead with rahma, which I think is just really important for me to say, like, Islam is for everyone in some ways in that regard. And so I think for me, that's just been really, really compelling to see both lived experience and research map on, and to be able to add to that.
Thank you so much, Alia and Yasmin, and everyone actually, for just this incredible conversation. I know, like, you know, working on this program, which was, you know, the first of its kind for us, and also the first of its kind on many of the campuses that we worked on. You know, there were a lot of lessons that we learned. There were a lot of, you know, trial and error kind of thing that we did, but what emerged from it was very simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking, and, you know, all of the things at once. And so I'm really grateful that, you know, we were all in community together, and the community that we ultimately cultivated from this, and the ongoing activism that is happening even after this programming has completed, is what is inspiring for, you know, what its future implications can be. So at this time, I know it, you know, we're 10 minutes out from the end of this, our time together, but I did want to open it up to see if anybody from the audience either wanted to drop a question in the chat box, or just, you know, turn on their mics, and we can, you know, take any questions or comments or feedback that you may have. We will be putting this on YouTube, so please share it with your friends and with your networks, and please do check out the report. I threw the link in the chat box again. So anyone? No pressure though. We want to hear what you all have to say though, for those of you hearing about this for the first time.
Would it be helpful to maybe stop the recording at this point?
We could very well do that if that's what people feel more comfortable with. Let me just stop that right now.